Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, no doubt by now you have heard the very sad news that actor Val Kilmer has passed away. It's kind of ironic for me personally that it happened when it did, because about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, I found myself watching Tombstone again. And then not long after that, I picked up this book to start reading, and then found out that I'm going to be heading out to that part of the southwestern United States to do a wedding for my mom, who lives about an hour from Tombstone, which is where many of the events associated with Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp and these guys all took place. So all of that was happening, and then to find out the news that Val Kilmer had passed away from pneumonia. He's been in poor health for a while now. I think most film aficionados agree that Val Kilmer's performance as Doc Holliday is one of the all-timers as far as historical characters' performances. And I'm one of those people who just absolutely loves it. There's so many quotable lines. But who was the real Doc Holliday? About the time that Tombstone, the movie, came out, there was also a movie starring Kevin Costner that came out called Wyatt Earp. Now, Tombstone, I think most people agree, is the better movie of the two, but Wyatt Earp's probably a little closer to the facts and to the reality. And you have Dennis Quaid playing Doc Holliday in that one, and I think probably is a little bit closer to the historic Doc Holliday, but oh my gosh, Val Kilmer's character is just phenomenal. And there's actually a lot that Tombstone does get right, even down to some of the quotes and some of the things that happen that you wouldn't think were real. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to take a look at Biographics and their video that came out about a year ago called Doc Holliday, the Deadliest Dentist of the Wild West. But we're also going to dive into some other sources. In particular, I want to look at some newspaper articles from the time and what they have to say about Doc Holliday. So I'll put the link down in the description to this video on the original channel. Let's dive into this one.
Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today we're talking about the deadliest dentist in the Wild West. That's right, Doc Holliday, with a script by the ever-capable Radu Alexander. If Radu gets around to giving us his socials, we'll link them right alongside ones for my storytelling podcast and deep dive channel, Story Rant, and more. With that said, let's get this mighty fine shindig started. And yeah, there are going to be a couple Firefly references here. Sorry, not sorry.
I don't know what Firefly is.
Doc Holliday was the Robin to Wyatt Earp's Batman. By his side whenever the going got tough, pistol in hand, ready to go, out in a blaze of glory. Their friendship became a legendary tale of the Wild West, depicted in many books and westerns. Holliday didn't necessarily act this way out of sheer bravery or an undying sense of loyalty, but for a more tragic reason.
Yeah. And when we look at fiction in movies and books and things like that, often the main characters have some catalyst, some reason that we may or may not be aware of that has driven them to the lifestyle or the actions that they have. In Doc Holliday's case, it's pretty easy to figure out what that is. It's tuberculosis, which was a very, very common illness. Just looking through my own family tree, a number of people, including my own paternal line great-great-grandfather, died in 1922 from tuberculosis at the age of 35. And to this day, in 2025, tuberculosis is the deadliest communicable disease on Earth. So they called it consumption very often back then, and consumption could be a range of things, but typically it was tuberculosis.
He knew that he was a doomed man anyway. Stricken with tuberculosis from an early age, before he even met Wyatt Earp, Holliday understood that he was living on borrowed time. So he chose to live it like a man with nothing to lose. In the process, he became one of the greatest icons of the Wild West. John Henry Doc Holliday was born in Griffin, Georgia on, well, we're not really sure, actually. His birth records were lost in a fire, but his baptism records...
This is way more common than you realize. Fires at courthouses and things like that happened all the time. It seems ridiculous that it happened as often as it did. And birth, people wonder, well, how on earth do we not have a birth record for these people? Well, most states didn't require birth and death certificates until the early 20th century. It varies from state to state. I think here in Ohio it's 1908. So before that, it was really like it was kept like in a ledger at the county courthouse. And for a lot of people, they weren't going to bother to go down to the county courthouse that might be like a half a day's ride away just to report a birth.
Was not, and it shows that Holliday was baptized as an infant at the Griffin Presbyterian Church on March 21st, 1852, so presumably he was born earlier that year.
Yeah.
His parents were Henry B. Holliday and Alice Jane McKee, both of Scottish descent. Doc had an older sister named Martha who died in infancy, and an adopted Mexican brother named Francisco, who also died before reaching adulthood. Henry Holliday did a little bit of everything. He was a lawyer and a planter before joining the military and going off to fight in the Mexican-American War. Afterward, he fought in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, where he reached the rank of major. He was one of the first people to settle in Griffin, which also...
I'm curious to know his background, Henry Holliday, Doc's father, in the Civil War, what unit he was with, what battles he fought. Let's take a look. Okay, so this is Henry Holliday's unit, the 27th Georgia Infantry. They fought in the Eastern Theater, Army of Northern Virginia. In fact, they were pretty heavily involved at some of the main battles, like Seven Pines, which is the battle where Robert E. Lee is going to become the commander of the Army. There was 150 casualties when they broke the center of the Federal line. He was a quartermaster with the regiment. They fought at South Mountain, but by the time they get to South Mountain, they get to Antietam, where they're again heavily involved. Henry Holliday had actually resigned, so he resigned in August of 1862. But I do want to correct something that they said in the video earlier, where they said that Doc Holliday's adopted brother, Francisco, died young. That's not true. I mean, he didn't die like as a child. He actually died in 1873 at the age of 37 in Georgia. And he also served in the Civil War. He was in the 30th Georgia Infantry. So there you go. That's Francis Hidalgo's grave right there. And I should mention about the 30th Georgia, Doc Holliday's adopted brother's unit, that he served all the way from the start of the war all the way to surrendering at Greensboro, North Carolina in April of 1865, including fighting at the Battle of Chickamauga. So pretty cool stuff.
Meant that he could buy a lot of land on the cheap. Holliday owned around 46 pieces of property in and around Griffin, covering several hundred acres, and later would also enter politics, serving one term as mayor of Valdosta, Georgia. The family had moved there in 1864, more out of necessity than desire. You see, Holliday Sr. was a true believer in the Confederacy and invested in Confederate dollars to support the cause. The cause, of course, being slavery. These dollars were not backed by hard assets, but by the promise of repaying the bearer once the South won the war and became independent. Well, joke's on him, because you may recall this little detail. That didn't actually happen, right? And the value of this currency plunged into the toilet, leaving Henry Holliday almost bankrupt. One of his few remaining possessions of any value was some property in Valdosta, a little town built on the railroad.
And this map we're looking at, these were really common in the latter half of the 19th century. I have a few of them myself for Youngstown and Niles, which are two of the local communities here. And they're these cool maps that are based on the actual buildings, and they're drawn as though they're an aerial view of the town. But it's a great way to see what individual buildings look like. So I know from that map, I was able to figure out exactly which house on the map belonged to my great-great-great-grandparents. And then when we found an old photo of what we believed was the family in front of the house, we were able to match up that image of the house with what we saw on the map. Really cool stuff.
So the Hollidays packed up and relocated there. In the new town, Doc enrolled in a private school called the Valdosta Institute, which provided him with a classical education that included not only subjects such as reading, writing, and mathematics, but also French, astronomy, history, and even Latin. We can't say
Latin was pretty common at the time. It was kind of just something people did when you were educated. A lot of times Greek as well.
How much book learning stuck to Doc Holliday, though? There wasn't much demand for Latin-speaking astronomers back in the Old West.
Great Scott!
His time in Valdosta was not a happy one. In 1866, his mother died of tuberculosis, or consumption as it was called back then, the same disease that would kill him 2 decades later.
It's a communicable disease, and you often see family members dying of it in succession, sometimes years apart, but it was a disease you could live with for decades. sometimes it killed you faster.
Deeply devoted to his mother, Doc was heartbroken by the sudden loss and then felt a deep sense of betrayal when his father remarried a young war widow just a few months later. This caused a rift between father and son that never healed and created a more bitter, angrier Doc. This led to probably the first incident when Holliday used his pistols against other people, and it happened when he got into an argument with a group of black men who wanted to use their swimming hole, leading to Doc firing a few shots to scare them off. This event, which is referred to as the swimming hole incident, has become part of Valdosta's history, but it has been retold and exaggerated many times, to the point where the truth has become quite murky, especially since some versions were told by people like Bat Masterson, who had an open dislike for Doc Holliday.
And Bat Masterson is somebody who's going to serve alongside of Wyatt Earp, and they kind of cross paths in different places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Doc and Wyatt and Bat are all kind of in the similar circles. And you can understand how, Wyatt Earp is not the upstanding lawman good guy that some often portray him as. He was very kind of gray area-ish, like a lot of people in life. And Bat Masterson was a lot more straight-laced, so I can see why he didn't really like Doc.
Some say it happened before Doc became a dentist. Others say it was after. Some say the black men were teenagers. Others that they were soldiers. Some say that Holliday shot in the air. Others that he killed two of them. According to the account given by Thomas McKee, Doc's uncle and the only witness, Doc and his friends had built that swimming hole and it was on McKee's land, so the strangers were trespassing. He added that Holliday fired over their heads, never intending to hit anyone, and historians have failed to find any mentions of any killings taking place at the time. So this seems like the most plausible scenario.
I agree.
The seriousness of the event is only lessened by the fact that it happened in a place with a funny name called Withlacoochee. The family feared that such incidents would only increase in frequency and severity, so they wanted to send Doc somewhere far away. This was a good time since he had finished school and needed to find a profession anyway. So it was decided, in 1870, off he went to study dentistry.
He went north for that. New York, maybe?
There seems to be a bit of controversy as to where exactly Doc Holliday studied to become a dentist, with some sources claiming he went to Baltimore, Maryland to attend the Baltimore College of Dental Surgery, while others say it was the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in Philadelphia. It's not really that important. Both were considered top-of-the-line schools, and Holliday graduated in 1872 without much hullabaloo. Of course, while he was there, Holliday also developed other talents, such as drinking, playing cards, and shooting pool, which ultimately he would put to much greater use than his dental skills. But that's still a few years off. For now, even though Holliday could call himself a bona fide doctor, it was still customary to apprentice for a while with an experienced dentist before trying to open his own practice. Where exactly he did this and in what order is, again, a matter of uncertainty.
You might wonder, well, why don't we know all these details? Well, Doc Holliday was just another random American dentist at that time. Learning the trade. And there was nothing particularly special about him that wouldn't have applied to thousands of other people. Nobody knew he was going to become the famous gunslinger out west that he did, and so people weren't just writing stuff down so we'd remember it.
It's possible he went to his hometown in Griffin before trying to set up shop in Atlanta, which was quickly becoming Georgia's grandest city. Or maybe it was the other way around. Holliday apprenticed for a while with Dr. Arthur C. Ford of Atlanta. Might have even tried to open a practice there before finding the competition a bit too stiff and returning to Griffin to try it there. Some even say he was in St. Louis, Missouri for a bit. Doc Holliday's history is a bit speculative because he ended up becoming a famous icon of the Wild West despite the odds being against him. Unlike guys like Wild Bill Hickok, he wasn't too well known in his own time, so magazines and newspapers didn't cover his exploits. Most of the main accounts and profiles on Doc Holliday came out decades after his death. Unlike guys like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, he didn't live into old age, so he'd have time to tell his story to historians and journalists.
Yeah, but Wyatt Earp did a really good job of telling Doc's story. He even wrote a pamphlet. I think you see it at the end of the movie Tombstone, where it says, "My friend Doc Holliday," and that was really something he did right.
He didn't leave behind a widow, children, or siblings to tell his tale. He didn't keep a diary or write letters to brag about his adventures. Doc Holliday seemed destined to become just another forgotten gunslinger of the Wild West. And yet, Here we are talking about him a century and a half later. Whatever the timeline of his dental career might be, it wasn't very relevant in the end because Holliday received a diagnosis that turned his life upside down completely. He had tuberculosis. He'd had it for a while, in fact. Likely, he caught it from his mother, but it took a few years for the symptoms to appear, which is a condition known as latent tuberculosis. But eventually, they caught up to him. Fever, tiredness, night sweats, coughing, choking, spitting up blood, all that wonderful stuff.
Yeah, it's a terrible existence. And like I said, sometimes you could live with this for decades. My third great-grandfather came home from the Civil War with tuberculosis, and that was in 1865. I think he left the service in fall of 64. He died in 1883 with that tuberculosis, so he lived with it for almost 2 decades.
Doc Holliday was a doomed man, and the Georgia weather wasn't doing him any favors. The winters were cold and rainy, and the summers were hot and muggy. Yep, what I call swamp-ass weather. His doctor gave Doc 6 months to live tops if he stayed in Georgia. But if he went somewhere with a warmer climate, he could last another year or two. So whatever plans and goals Doc Holliday had were immediately shelved, and he headed to start a new life. Whatever was left of it out west.
And the timing's good on this because in the aftermath of the Civil War, you've got the Transcontinental Railroad, you've got people migrating in mass numbers to the west, and so you've got places like Kansas and Nebraska, but you've also got Arizona and New Mexico and the Wild West, as we call it today.
Doc Holliday made his way to Dallas, Texas in 1873, where he intended to resume his dental career. At first, he partnered up with a dentist named John A. Segar, which I guess is pronounced the same way some people in the South say cigar, who was also from Georgia and an acquaintance of his father. According to Dallas records, the two had an office on Elm Street in one of the busiest parts of town. There's not a lot of info on Doc's prowess with a dental drill, but it seems that he was good enough to win awards, at least when he teamed together with Segar. During the 1873 annual fair of the North Texas Agricultural, Mechanical, and Bloodstock Association at the Dallas County Fair, the team of Segar and Holliday took home 3 awards. The best set of teeth in gold, the best in vulcanized rubber, and the big one that all the dentists covet, the best set of artificial teeth and dental wear.
Nice.
Eventually, Holliday felt confident enough to open his own practice, but it didn't last.
Yeah, and we actually, there are newspaper articles you can see where it says J.H. Holliday, dentist, and maybe we'll even look up a couple of those, but we can see these advertisements, so we know he was practicing dentistry. But he must have, at least at first when he went out west, the cough must have calmed down, because you're not going to get a lot of clients coughing blood in people's faces.
Remember that he came to Texas with a death sentence looming over his head. That sort of thing tends to change a man.
Yeah.
And Doc took to heavy drinking to cope with his impending demise. On the increasingly rare occasion when he was sober, he could be quite a mean bastard. And these weren't really the type of qualities that people look for in their dentist. Fortunately for Holliday, while he was frequenting the many watering holes that Dallas had to offer, he also took to gambling, and he was pretty good at it. Poker was popular in those days, but even more popular was Faro, the game that Doc favored. Nowadays, Faro has all but disappeared from the gambling tables, and that's mainly because the rules did not give the house the advantage as much.
Not only the rules didn't give the house the advantage, it's really easy to cheat. It's easy for both sides to cheat in that game.
Much as other card games. So casinos wanted to get rid of it. Anyway, with Doc's practice dwindling but his Faro skills sharpening, it didn't take long before gambling became his main source of income. And then 1875 came, and Holliday was still around. The 2 years that his doctor gave him were up and he was still alive. And yet, he knew that he was on borrowed time, and Doc wasn't really the glass half full kind of guy. So each day he became more nervous and ornery. Eventually, this led to Holliday getting into a fight with a saloon keeper named Austin, and pistols were drawn and fired. This was Doc's only shootout incident in Dallas, and nobody was hurt, but he was still told to leave town. Holliday settled in Jacksboro, Texas, or as the locals call it, Jacksboro, Texas, for a while, where, according to some reports of dubious veracity, he killed 2 men on separate occasions, both over gambling arguments. His second victim was a soldier with the 6th Cavalry Regiment, and this put him in serious hot water with the government. Doc had no choice but to flee Texas and go to Colorado.
So let's take a minute here because I want to show you a newspaper article I came across when I was just kind of looking for stuff before we started this video. I thought this was kind of an interesting one. So this is from the Dallas Weekly Herald. This is 1877, so this is after all of the events we just talked about. And we may not even be talking about the same guy, I don't know, but this is how newspaper articles went sometimes. Killed. Our report was told in Fort Worth yesterday that a young man named Doc Holliday, well known in this city, was shot and killed at Breckenridge last Wednesday by a young man named Con. Our informant stated that Holliday had caned Con and both were arrested and fined. Holliday met Con and attacked him again when Con shot. Con was cleared at the examination. So that's one of the earliest references you'll find in a newspaper to Doc Holliday, at least that name. You'll see J.H. Holliday a lot of places for him for like dentistry and things like that. But most of the Doc Holliday references that we know for sure refer to him are going to come starting in 1881.
For the next few years, he spent life on the road. Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, the Dakota Territory, traveling from town to town under the alias of Tom Mackey, or McKee, and making money from gambling,
his mom's
faro
maiden
dealing,
name.
and even the occasional back alley dentistry, which sounds absolutely terrifying. After a while, Holliday decided the law was no longer after him, and he went back to Texas and even started using his own name again. His return to the Lone Star State was not an auspicious one. In Breckenridge, he got into a gambling fight again with a man named Henry Con.
Oh, there we go.
Trying to a bit more even-tempered, Holliday didn't go for his gun. Instead, he picked up his walking stick and gave Con a damn good thrashing.
So this is the story we saw, but in the newspaper article it said that Con killed Holliday.
Men were arrested, fined, and released. But that was not the end of the matter. Con approached Holliday in the street, and even though Doc wasn't armed, the other man shot him. Days later, the Dallas Weekly Herald wrote that Doc Holliday had died, which wasn't true. But although
This is what happens when I don't watch these videos ahead of time, that I'm doing these reactions live. I didn't know they were going to talk about that.
the report of his death had been exaggerated, it wasn't by much. The gunshot injury, compounded by Holliday's tuberculosis, had made recovery a toss of the coin. Fortunately, Doc did recover, but he felt that a change of scenery might be in order. He traveled to Fort Griffin, where several important events occurred. First, he met Catherine Horney, better known as Big Nose Kate. They began a relationship that lasted about 5 years, on and off as a common-law marriage. But even more significantly, Doc Holliday made the acquaintance of a fellow gunslinger whose name would become inexorably linked to his.
Yep. What? Barry Stapp Earp.
Let's set the scene. It was November 1877 in Fort Griffin, Texas. A tired and dusty deputy U.S. Marshal entered through the doors of the Beehive Saloon owned by an acquaintance of his, called John Chastney. His name was Wyatt Earp, and he was in pursuit of a no-good outlaw named Dirty Dave Rudabaugh.
So yeah, if you've ever seen Young Guns, sometimes they call him Arkansas Dave or Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, you know that Christian Slater plays Dave Rudabaugh, I think, in Young Guns too. And yeah, in fact, I mean, you've got Doc Holliday. In fact, I think in the movie Wyatt Earp, there's a scene where they talk about Dave Rudabaugh, and that's how they meet, is Wyatt's looking for him. Kind of cool to see the crossover between the Billy the Kid story and the Wyatt Earp story.
Back in October, Rudabaugh and his gang robbed a Santa Fe Railroad construction camp, and ever since then, Earp had been on their trail for hundreds of miles, chasing them through Kansas and the Texas Panhandle. He got word that they passed through Fort Griffin. Chansey confirmed this, saying that Rudabaugh and his men stopped by his bar and that he didn't know where they went afterward. However, there was a quiet guy sitting in a dark corner of the saloon who played cards with them.
And this is exactly how Wyatt Earp, the movie, shows this scene. He's sitting in like a tent saloon.
Maybe he had a better idea. Wyatt Earp walked up to this man. Doc Holliday invited him to sit down, but the marshal refused. He only wanted information. Doc knew the fellas Earp was talking about, but wasn't certain where they went. He thought, based off the few off-the-cuff remarks they made, that they intended to double back and return to Kansas. Wyatt Earp's instincts told him to trust the stranger, so he sent a message to Dodge City, Kansas, to tell them that Rudabaugh was back in their neck of the woods. And Doc's information was correct. A few days later, a posse led by Dodge City lawman Charlie Bassett set an ambush for the robbers outside a ranch on the Cherokee Strip and caught the whole gang without firing a shot. Both Earp and Holliday probably assumed that that would be their last interaction, but that was not to be. In January 1878, Holliday wore out his welcome in Fort Griffin, to put it mildly. After yet another gambling argument, Doc sliced open a guy named Ed Bailey when the latter started reaching for his gun. Bailey bled out on the poker table, and Holliday surrendered peacefully to the authorities.
That's the scene in the movie Tombstone where he gets accused of cheating, and Val Kilmer just brilliantly portrays that scene where he's like, if I didn't think you were my friend, I don't believe I could bear it. And, I can't do the accent or anything, but so many good scenes.
Going by frontier law, Doc should have been okay since it was self-defense, but Bailey had a lot of friends, and the only justice they were looking for was at the end of a noose. Kate really came through in the clutch on this one and saved Holliday's life, as he was just a few moments from getting lynched by an angry mob. First, she set fire to an old shanty to cause a distraction. Then, she snuck into the place where Doc was being kept, held the deputy at gunpoint, and got him to release the prisoner. Doc and Kate then made off into the night, their destination, Dodge City.
And let me just address this quote right now, because I see a lot of people saying, well, he didn't say I'm your huckleberry. He said like I'm your huckle something, or it had to do with like the hinges on a coffin or something. But no, he definitely, in fact, in the movie, he definitely says huckleberry, because Val Kilmer even wrote an autobiography where it uses the word huckleberry in the title. So he definitely was saying huckleberry. It basically just is a phrase that means like I'm the guy you want, that kind of thing. It's not to be confused with the other phrase that people claim it is.
We are definitely not saying that Holliday went to Dodge City expecting to partner up with Earp. In fact, he wanted to resume his dental practice because he posted this announcement in the June 28th edition of the Dodge City Times. J.H. Holliday, dentist, very respectfully offers his professional services to the citizens of Dodge City and surrounding county during the summer. Office at room 24, Dodge House.
His office is in a hotel, a lodging room.
Where satisfaction is not given, money will be refunded. But it seems that fate was determined to let Holliday be anything but a dentist, and his friendship with Earp was permanently cemented one day when Doc saved Wyatt's life. Annoyingly, we're not completely sure how it happened since multiple stories are floating around. In one version, Holliday saw a man reach for his gun to shoot Earp in the back, so he reached and shot first. As a great fictional man once said, "Someone ever tries to kill you, you try to kill him right back." In the most common version, retold by Earp himself, he entered a saloon looking to get the drop on two wanted men named Toby Driscoll and Ed Morrison. Unfortunately for him, they were there with friends, and before Wyatt even knew it, he had about a dozen guns pointed at him. And as luck would have it, Holliday was in the back of the saloon playing cards. When he heard the commotion and recognized Earp, Doc snuck up behind Morrison, put a gun to his head, and told everyone to drop their weapons. The newly formed crime-fighting duo then arrested the lot of them and took them to jail. We're going to say there is some artistic license in the story, mainly because there was no mention of this event in the Dodge City papers.
Right, and you have to remember, as with all sources, who's the source and what is their goal in what they're saying. And obviously, Wyatt Earp is looking to portray himself and his friend Doc Holliday in the best possible light. So is it possible that's how it happened? Yeah, it is. But it definitely doesn't mean that it had to happen that way just because Wyatt Earp said it did.
Or the arrest records. Later, while testifying in court following the shootout at the OK Corral, Earp was a bit vaguer on the origin of their friendship, simply stating that Doc saved his life when he was surrounded by desperados. However it happened, Doc and Wyatt were now BFFs, but they still lived separate lives. In fact, Doc and Kate soon left Dodge City and moved to Las Vegas. No, not that one, the one in New Mexico. Holliday gambled, practiced dentistry, and even opened up his own saloon. But once again, he got into trouble following a shootout, this time with a guy called Charlie White. So in 1880, the two packed up their things again and traveled to Tombstone, Arizona. This is where the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral happened on October 26, 1881. Probably the most famous shootout in Wild West history.
And it didn't happen at the OK Corral. It happened in an empty lot next to, I think, Fly's photography studio in the OK Corral.
And we've covered it extensively in our bio for Wyatt Earp, so if you want to hear all the nitty-gritty details, it's there for your viewing pleasure. Here's the Reader's Digest version. U.S. Marshal Virgil Earp had been sent to Tombstone to deal with a group of outlaws called the Cowboys. He brought along his brothers, Wyatt and Morgan, and Doc Holliday. Tensions between the two sides kept growing. They started with taunts and veiled threats, but everyone knew that it would eventually turn bloody. On that fateful morning, one of the Cowboys, Ike Clanton, after an entire night of drinking and card playing, had been arrested for causing trouble for carrying a gun within city limits, which was against the law. The Earps arrested him, and Virgil also gave him a pistol whipping for good measure.
And played by Stephen Lang in the movie Tombstone, who's going to be at the Gettysburg Film Festival. You should definitely come. I'll be there. A lot of great people are going to be there. You should check it out.
Mike was in court. A few other Cowboys arrived to back him up. His brother, Billy Clanton, plus Frank and Tom McClowry. Another guy named Billy Claiborne was also present, but he was unarmed and made a run for it when the shooting started. Word reached the Earps that the Cowboys were in town, packing heat and refusing to disarm. So they picked up Doc Holliday and went to confront them. Despite the name, the gunfight didn't actually happen at the OK Corral, but near it. Virgil Earp told the Cowboys to drop their weapons, which predictably they refused to do. Who shot first remains a mystery due to different eyewitness accounts, so anyway, they started blasting. When the dust settled, the tally was 3 dead and 3 wounded. Billy Clanton and the McClowry brothers had been killed. Morgan and Virgil Earp took a bullet each but survived.
So did Doc Holliday.
Doc Holliday likely killed Tom McClowry and received a grazing wound for his troubles. Yeah. Wyatt Earp was the only one unhurt. The feud hardly stopped there. 2 assassination attempts were made.
So let me pause here because I want to take a look at a newspaper article from just a couple days after this and see what it has to say about these events, because it's pretty fascinating. So this is from the Arizona Weekly Citizen on October 30th, which would have been the very first edition of the paper after the gunfight. It's from Tucson, so we're talking, 30, 40, 50 miles away from Tombstone. But it's really detailed as far as what it talks about. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it gives a lot of the background into what brought them to this point. But I'll read what it says about what actually happened at that moment. It says, don't go. So they run into Sheriff Behan. And a lot of this will sound familiar because the way it was portrayed in the 2 movies is pretty close to this. Don't go down there or there will be trouble. I have been down there to disarm them, the sheriff says. But they passed on. Let me zoom in a little further so you can see it better. They passed on, and when within a few feet of them, the marshal said to the Clantons and McClowrys, "Throw up your hands, boys. I intend to disarm you." This was really close. I mean, they're in an area that's maybe 20, 30 feet wide. They're about 6 feet apart from each other when the shooting happened. This wasn't some big, huge area that they were in. It was a confined space. As he spoke, Frank McClowry made a motion to draw his revolver when Wyatt Earp pulled his and shot him, the ball striking on the right side of his abdomen. About the same time, Doc Holliday shot Tom McClowry in the right side using a short shotgun, such as carried by Wells Fargo and Company's messengers. In the meantime, Billy Clanton had shot at Morgan Earp, the ball passing through the point of the left shoulder blade across his back, just grazing the backbone and coming out at the shoulder, the ball remaining inside of his shirt. This detail is incredible. And remember, we don't know how much of this is factual because we just looked at an article saying Doc Holliday was killed a couple years earlier. So he fell to the ground, but in an instant gathered himself and, raising in a sitting position, fired at Frank McClowry as he crossed Fremont Street. And at the same instant, Doc Holliday shot at him, both balls taking effect, either of which would have proved fatal. And this is exactly how they showed that in the Tombstone movie. They show both of them firing at the same time, as one struck him on the right temple and the other in the left breast. As he started across the street, however, he pulled his gun down on Holliday, saying, "I've got you now," which is what they show, only I think he says a little more than that. "Blaze away, you're a daisy if you have," replied Doc. In the movie, he says, "You're a daisy if you do." This shot of McClowry's passed through Holliday's pistol pocket, just grazing the skin. While this was going on, Billy Clanton had shot Virgil Earp through the right leg, the ball passing through the calf, inflicting a severe flesh wound. In turn, he had been shot by Morg Earp in the right side of the abdomen, and twice by Virgil Earp, once in the right wrist and once in the left breast. And then it goes on to describe more of it. So there you go. That gives you a little bit of a newspaper article just a few days after the gunfight at the OK Corral.
Made on the Earps in the months that followed, one that killed Morgan Earp and another that left Virgil permanently maimed.
Yeah.
As revenge, Wyatt Earp formed a posse, which of course included Doc Holliday, and set off on the infamous Vendetta ride, which resulted in 4 more cowboy deaths.
Yeah, this is something Tombstone gets very wrong. Tombstone makes it look like they killed like dozens of guys or like went after a bunch. They didn't, and a lot of the guys that you see being killed in that Vendetta ride weren't, and that's one of the parts that really is off on the history.
Again, watch the Wyatt Earp bio for the full story.
And there's a great scene, and there's no evidence it actually happened, but one of my favorite quotes in the movie Tombstone is when one of the guys on the Vendetta ride says to Doc, who's obviously in very poor health, "Why are you doing this? You should be in bed." And Doc responds with, "Wyatt Earp is my friend." And the guy says, "Well, I got a lot of friends." And Doc says, "I don't." And that really does sum up the relationship that those two guys had.
Since the Vendetta was basically vigilantism, arrest warrants were issued for all participants, so Holliday fled Arizona after it was over in April 1882, only to be arrested in Denver 2 months later. However, Wyatt Earp and a few other influential friends persuaded Colorado Governor Pitkin to refuse the extradition request to the Arizona Territory, eventually leading to Holliday getting released on bond. Doc and Wyatt Earp then parted ways, thus ending one of the Old West's most iconic partnerships. Although, according to Earp, he did see Doc one more time a few years later, shortly before the latter's death.
Yep.
Truth be told, Holliday's final years were pretty rough. Kate left him and he wandered from town to town, getting whatever work he could find as his tuberculosis kept getting worse and worse. To ease the symptoms, Holliday turned not only to alcohol but also laudanum. By the time he ended up in Leadville, Colorado in 1883, he was a shell of his former self. However, he did have one final shootout in this town with a bartender and former policeman named Billy Allen. Allen was in cahoots with a few wrong-uns who hated Holliday and wanted him dead. Doc also owed Allen $5.
Oh no, not $5.
The latter was going to use the debt as a pretext to kill him. That's why, when Allen confronted him, Doc opened fire right away. He shot twice, hitting Allen once below his right shoulder. Although an artery was severed, Allen survived the encounter, and Holliday was arrested and sent to trial. The legal ordeal lasted almost a year, but on April 4th, 1885, Doc Holliday was acquitted. Thanks to multiple testimonies, his lawyers had convinced the jury that Allen went to Holliday intending to do him harm, and that Doc was right to protect himself. He might have evaded a prison sentence, but now Holliday was on his last legs due to his tuberculosis. He feared leaving Colorado because he risked extradition to Arizona again. So instead, he moved around the state for a while before finally settling in Glenwood Springs in May 1887, hoping that the hot springs there would ease his suffering. They didn't do much. Doc Holliday passed away on November 8th, 1887, aged 36. Allegedly, as he lay in bed dying, he looked at his shoeless feet and, amused by the idea that he wasn't killed with his boots on, his last words were, "This is funny. This is funny."
Yeah, so that was good. Learned a lot about that, about Doc. I didn't know there, some details. And like I said, take everything with a grain of salt because we don't always have the best sources on this stuff, even from things that happened 150 years ago. So just a couple of things real quick I want to let you know about. Number one is the Gettysburg Film Festival. I'll put a link in the description. I'm going to be on later with JD from the History Underground, along with Jared Frederick, Dr. Jared Frederick from Real History, and Eric Dorr from the Gettysburg Museum of History for a live stream. And we're going to be announcing a pretty big Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan connection that's going to be at the Gettysburg Film Festival. And I'm actually going to be interviewing him on stage before we do a screening of Saving Private Ryan, and then he'll be doing some stuff with JD and Eric the next day. So pretty excited about that. Also, we're doing another trip to Egypt. It's going to be the first week of December of this year. So I'll put a link down in the description as well for that. So you can book it. We've already booked a number of people who are going on that. We've got about 14 spots left. Would love to take you to Egypt for the next one. Thanks for watching.